It's the early afternoon of October 5th, 1986, a quiet Sunday in the rural town of Thorntown, Indiana. Around 10 neighborhood kids from a trailer home community on Plum Street are playing a game that's a quintessential childhood experience, hide and seek. Among them is kindergartner Shannon Marie Sherrill. As the children counted and Shannon found a place to hide, Shannon completely disappeared. Her scent would be traced in a zigzag pattern off of the property and suddenly stop. The immediate aftermath of her disappearance would cause a frenzied search that this area had never seen and lead down a path of chilling suspects connected to other sexual offenses, abductions, and murders. This is A Simpler Time True Crime: The Disappearance of Shannon Sherrill. Shannon Marie Sherrill was born on August 12, 1980, to Dorothy and Mike Sherrill. The couple had divorced prior to Shannon's disappearance, and Shannon lived primarily with her mother and attended Thorntown Elementary School, but she had regular visits with her father Mike in his home in nearby Tipton, Indiana. Thorntown is a very rural community. It just recently got a Dollar General, and otherwise it just kind of has a gas station. It's in between Lafayette, Indiana, and Indianapolis, Indiana. Tipton is slightly northeast of Indy and about a 45-minute drive away from Shannon's mom's house. Census data of Thorntown shows that it's always just been around 1,400 or 1,500 people. Shannon's father Mike owned a gas station in Tipton along US 31, and his sister Debbie owned the restaurant next door. The business was first owned by their parents, so it was in the family. Town regulars and people passing through alike both loved the hospitality they'd receive at this Midwest diner and pit stop, and they especially loved the sign outside that read, "Eat here and get gas." Shannon was described as being extremely shy and sweet-natured. She was also really tiny for her age. She was only 3 feet tall and 30 pounds. Her Aunt Debbie recalled in a 1994 article by the Kokomo Tribune that she loved getting new clothes. One of her last memories she had of her was taking her to JCPenney's and buying her purple corduroy pants and a matching purple shirt. After all, purple, specifically lavender, was her favorite color. When they had gotten home from that trip, she curled her hair and put on some jewelry, and Shannon stood in front of the mirror showing off like a model. Shannon loved all sorts of costume jewelry, especially fancy necklaces. She was very protective and motherly towards her little brother, and she was also motherly towards her favorite Cabbage Patch doll, which was given to her by her grandma, Ann Sherrill. She was particularly close with her paternal grandmother and loved to hear her sing. Her grandma would sing to her while giving her baths. On the afternoon of October 5th, 1986, around 1:30 p.m., Shannon was playing hide and seek with a group of neighborhood kids. Her mom had company over, 2 of her 4 sisters and one of her sister's boyfriends, along with a couple of friends. Shannon's little brother was in and out of the house like kids sometimes are, sometimes playing with the big kids and sometimes heading back in with the adults. It was an unseasonably warm fall day, but I don't know the exact temperature. What I do know is that she was wearing a white sundress with blue lace trim and she was barefoot. I get the sense that it was one of those fall days where it's been kind of cold and suddenly you get that warm day and your threshold for temperatures grows, so you bust out your shorts and your short dress and everything, and especially kids, they tend to do that, so I think that might have been the case. So anyways, she was playing hide and seek, and it was taking place around the lot of her property and next door. And if you've ever played hide and seek with a small child, she was hiding in a pretty standard 6-year-old spot, just right behind a vehicle, not really all that hidden, but maybe in her eyes she was. The vehicle belonged to the friend or one of the friends of her mom's who was visiting, and he was getting ready to leave. And I have to give him credit. He had the wherewithal to check, and he asked her to move. I know that's how I am. If I ever see kids playing around and I know I have to move my vehicle, I'm always looking for kids to be around it, but not everybody has that sense. And so statistically speaking, that would have been much more likely the event she would have encountered was something, tragic in that regard. But luckily this guy said, "Hey, Shannon, I'm getting ready to go. Can you, please move out of the way?" So she had to find a new hiding spot. She started to walk back towards the direction of her house while one of the other kids counted. And you know how kids are again. They'll say they're going to count to 30, but I'm sure they only counted for about 10 seconds. And so they said it was really quick. They just were counting. And then in that instant, she was gone. The kids were not immediately concerned, of course, because after all, they were playing hide and seek and Shannon was supposed to be hiding. Her mom had been preparing lunch for her little brother, and then she came out to see if Shannon was ready for lunch. And it had only been about 5 or 10 minutes since she had last seen her because the mom had actually popped out really fast to say goodbye to that man who was leaving. So she had been outside, went back inside, prepared that lunch, and then just came out to say, "Hey, Shannon, lunch is ready. Are you ready to eat?" And she wasn't there. And the kids who had been looking for her said, "Hey, we can't find her either." Now, I know there's exceptions to every rule, and I think of, for example, cases I've come across where kids with autism have a tendency to hide sometimes and can be really, really skilled at it. But for the most part, a typical 6-year-old child's not very good at hiding. If anything, they start to make noises to give away their hiding spot, or they get bored and they come out. So the kids were really puzzled, and Dorothy was concerned, like as I said, right away. Not only because she didn't really think Shannon would be able to hide that well, but also because she said that Shannon was the type of child who would pop inside to tell her mom any detail. So if she was going to pop into the neighbor's yard or go across the street, she would come in and tell her mom. So Dorothy conducted a very quick cursory search, and then she called police. More specifically, she called the town marshal at the time, Gary Campbell. Reports state it was about 15 to 20 minutes after she initially couldn't find her that she called police. To their credit, they moved very quickly. Neighbors, police, search parties, they all mobilized into action, and more than 200 people, including police officers, neighbors, and volunteers, all searched. If you think about the population of that small town, and then all these people that are looking, that's like a huge percentage of people out solely dedicating their time to try to find this little girl. That search party also included her dad, Mike. He had been moving that day into his new home, and he was doing that thing where he was going back and forth and moving furniture kind of on his own. And after one of his particular trips, he found a note on his windshield saying to call his ex-wife and a number to call the police. He, of course, thought that was very odd, and then that was the way he found out his daughter was missing. So he got right on the road and immediately came to help search. The search went on all evening and overnight. There was no stopping or calling off the search because it was dark out, because even though it was an unseasonably warm day, it still dropped to a really chilly temperature that night. And again, they knew she was wearing nothing but a sundress and no shoes. And so if she wandered off and had gotten lost, the elements in time were not on their side. They searched the area trailers, in and around them, just in case she got stuck somewhere hiding. They canvassed the neighborhood and questioned the neighbors and even looked at extended out areas around the little community there, just trying to find any place she could have gotten stuck or encountered an accident while she was hiding. And to give you an idea of how dedicated they were, here's a visual according to Gary Campbell. He said, quote, "We even stuck a small guy down a storm grate and held him by his ankles," end quote. After a long night of searching, the next day they did bring out search dogs to track her scent, and they had success with it. They tracked her about 600 yards to a cornfield and then to a cemetery where the trail just stopped. I'll post a bird's eye Google view map of Shannon's whole neighborhood on our Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod. This will help you get a feel for the distance we're talking about and the layout. The cornfield is before where the cemetery is located. She would have reached that first. And in that cornfield, they found a set of children's footprints, barefoot footprints, obviously. And so because they were a small set of child footprints, they thought they were hers. But ultimately, she had, again, like the rest of her body, she had really small feet, and they were too big to be hers. It's unclear if those footprints have anything at all to do with her disappearance, but police seem to steer away from it. However, because it's mentioned and because we don't know what happened to her, I thought I would at least mention it. In the grand scheme of things, there are really not a lot of news articles and publications about the case out there, but the ones that are often cite this scent tracking as the proof of Shannon wandering off in the direction possibly to hide. And police felt this way too. But if you go deep through the interviews, her mom Dorothy said that Shannon was, number one, much too fearful to ever go down that far on her own. And number two, they loved to take walks together, and that was a typical walking route of theirs. So of course her scent is going to show up. To me, that proves unreliable for the tracking piece of it. At least, I'm sure it was Shannon's scent. It's just, it doesn't prove that she ran there on that day to hide, and that's where something happened. Still hopeful that Shannon encountered some sort of accident or getting stuck somewhere, police brought in helicopters and borrowed a military heat-sensing device from the U.S. Army. Their search extended then well beyond Little Thorntown, and the searchers, law enforcement officers, and people from all jurisdictions expanded their search all over Boone County. Many of the officers did so on their own time. They just were really dedicated to finding this little girl. The search in those early days was just relentless, even the days to come. In an interview years later, Thorntown Marshal Bill Crouch would say, "I've been underneath every trailer in that court. We looked every place. I think about her every day." Dorothy and Mike were given polygraph tests and they passed. They also had alibis accounting for their whereabouts the whole time. There's absolutely zero suspicion on either one of them. But both of them have spoken out over the years later, and they've discussed how tough this time was on them. Obviously, there's the piece about their daughter being missing, which is the primary stressor in grief, but also just how they were treated by being interviewed by police. Dorothy in particular. In one sense, they both understood that part of a investigation is checking closest to home, but at the same time, Dorothy felt like they were wasting their time because she knew she had nothing to do with it. She remembers getting frustrated with investigators because they were asking if she has an insurance policy out on her daughter. And all she could think of was just go take that effort and apply it to the actual investigation into my daughter. Someone else has her. Someone else has done something with her. So go take care of that. She also said she felt like no matter how she acted, it wasn't the right way to act. Early on, she was frantic when she called investigators and they told her she had to calm down. And so she kind of channeled that and calmed down and had that calming presence. And then they said, "Well, you're being kind of emotionless." And she said, "Pick how you want me to be." I have to wonder if how her early treatment in the investigation is what impacted how she reacted in the years to come. Dorothy has been highly criticized in really veiled ways, but on online forums and different communities about the way that she has handled her grief. For example, she got rid of most of her daughter's things, and she says that she tries not to think about her. So oftentimes then Dorothy is painted as very cold and uncaring and suspicious, but I don't think anybody who hasn't gone through such a painful tragedy should weigh in on how a family should react. I think that families receive way too much criticism for how they manage their grief, and there's such a microscope on them. And so I just wanted to point that out and say that for Dorothy's benefit, because she really has been really scrutinized over the years. When Shannon didn't show up anywhere after those initial searches, police began to suspect foul play and classified her case as non-family abduction. Non-family abduction is the rarest type of case in the United States, and while it is the rarest, it also has the poorest outcomes. Non-family abductions are the overarching terms for stranger and acquaintance abductions, with the subset category of those stereotypical abductions. The exact number varies across multiple sources, but those stereotypical abductions that you're picturing of some random stranger just kind of passing through and grabbing someone off the street is around 100 of those a year. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, attempted non-family abductions most often occur on the street while children are playing, walking, or riding their bike. One aspect of this case that really baffled investigators, though, is that there were a ton of possible witnesses. For starters, all of those children. Sure, that seeker in hide and seek has their eyes closed, but the other kids were going off and hiding too. None of the kids playing witnessed anything unusual then or could recall anything in later years. They were even put under hypnosis and couldn't produce anything. According to Bill Crouch, there were responsible adults out that day who would have said something if they saw a child being led away and forced into a vehicle. At the trailer next door, there were 2 men working on a vehicle, and across the street, there were 2 women sitting on their porch. All were interviewed, and everyone claimed to have seen nothing. One theory that was considered by both law enforcement and the greater community was that her abduction happened immediately after the Thornton's Festival of Turning Leaves, and maybe that had something to do with it. It's a big event every year, and so they thought it was possible that a non-local had been passing through for this event. The Thornton Festival of Turning Lights has happened every year in the fall since the early 70s, except for when COVID happened. It has food, live music, a parade, vendors, crafts, kid zones, and most of the village area does garage sales too. It draws in a huge crowd to the area, and Thornton looks forward to it every single year. But if I have to be honest, I have the sense that the general public latched onto this theory for their own self-preservation. Sure, it would be sad that Shannon was kidnapped by some evil predator who came through their town for the festival and left, but at least then they could feel the comfort in knowing that it wasn't their neighbor. Police continued to canvass the neighborhoods, and it paid off because one of the neighbors they previously had missed proved to be a witness. One of Shannon's neighbors reported seeing a suspicious red truck speeding through the area on the morning of her disappearance. Several days later, a couple from Lafayette, Indiana, reported seeing a sighting of Shannon. According to the statement, the couple was traveling on US 52 and were en route to Lafayette from Indianapolis when they saw a red pickup truck with a camper shell on the front end speed past them. Just as a quick side note, there is never a time I hear of a red truck with a camper shell that I don't think of Morgan Nick. Morgan Nick was a young girl abducted from a Little League baseball field who has also never been found, and where a red truck with a camper shell was identified as a possible suspect vehicle. To be clear, I'm not suggesting these cases are related. They're nearly a decade and 700 miles apart, but the similarity was just eerie. The couple stated that the truck was being driven by an unidentified man and he appeared to be driving erratically. They said he was acting crazy, and in addition to this, they noticed that there was a little girl in the truck next to him right in the passenger seat. The sighting occurred very shortly after Shannon was discovered as missing, possibly within an hour afterwards. To this day, it's obviously unclear if the girl was indeed Shannon, but it was possibly a sighting. Now, going back to that morning, the man visiting the mom that day had driven a red pickup truck, that truck that was getting ready to leave when Shannon was hiding behind it. And so he was questioned, but he did not have a camper shell. According to an October 11th, 1986 article in the Indianapolis News, this friend was cleared. In peak 1980s form, the couple who saw the truck was put under hypnosis, but it really didn't provide any reliable results. I feel like every case I ever listened to or researched from the 80s had somebody who was getting hypnotized to try to get some answers. But it's been proven in the years since that it is not a reliable source of information and it doesn't hold up in court. Police never were able to identify the driver of this red pickup truck. Running into walls, police continued to look into possible relevant suspects like a local sex offender from the area, but they were able to clear him with an airtight alibi. It wasn't until 4 years later, in 1990, when they identified their first possible suspect. In April of 1990, investigators announced a person of interest as David Ray Moore, a 49-year-old factory worker from the Indianapolis area who was tied to a series of attacks, rapes, and abductions of women and teen girls beginning in about 1986. Actually, his first run-in with law enforcement was in the late 1960s for indecent exposure. Yup, like so many other people we talk about, he was a sexual predator who had that peeping Tom and indecent exposure to violent rapist pipeline. He had been dubbed the Blazer Rapist due to the fact that he was known to attack women while driving around in his black Chevy Blazer. Boone County Sheriff's Office, Indiana State Police, and the FBI were all working on Shannon's case and had come together to discuss whether David Ray Moore was a viable suspect in Shannon's case. Moore faced charges in Boone, Hendricks, and Hamilton counties, both abduction rapes and attempted abductions. Here's a snapshot of his violent crime spree. On March 23, 1988, he raped a 17-year-old near Pittsboro, which is 24 miles southeast of Thorntown. Then, a Morgan County woman identified Moore as the man who had raped her on October 25, 1988. She said a man in a four-door black Blazer flashed his lights and was signaling for her to pull over on Mann Road in Madison Township. She did, thinking something was wrong with her vehicle, and when she did, he forced her into his vehicle and raped her. Ultimately, he did let her go in the end, and this area was about 45 miles south of where Shannon's abduction occurred. If you listened to my episode on Alicia Showalter Reynolds and the Route 29 stalker, this is going to sound familiar. Obviously, Moore was incarcerated by the time of Alicia's abduction and murder in the 90s, so this was just a familiar tactic seemingly during this time. Again, this is pretty obsolete at this point. We have cell phones, we aren't pulling over for some stranger because we know we have the tools to handle it ourselves and the ability to call for help. But these women felt more vulnerable, and they felt, this Good Samaritan is asking me to pull over, they must be trying to help. Or, even if they did have some apprehension, they still had to weigh their options. In late March of 1990, he abducted a 41-year-old Zionsville woman, which is 28 miles southeast of Thorntown. He abducted her from her car and raped her before letting her go. He was taken down after an attempted abduction in early 1990, which resulted in a host of charges. David Ray Moore was also charged in the case of a 12-year-old girl who he attempted to abduct in Lebanon on October 17, 1986. You'll notice that was just 12 days after Shannon went missing. This young girl was walking down the street when he pulled up and asked her for directions to Fortsville, which is 46 miles southeast of Lebanon. Thorntown's in the middle of those two areas. As she got closer to his vehicle, he pulled a gun on her, but she ran away. He was charged with attempted confinement and attempted abduction. After his arrest, his family members would go on to say that he acted erratic in the days after Shannon's disappearance. His wife said he had clipped a newspaper article of Shannon, but by the time this came up, she said it had disappeared and she couldn't find it. When he was arrested, he admitted to 5 rapes and said that he had done 15 to 20 more attempted ones. His victims all said he would flag them down and use the guise of vehicle troubles. Another thing to note was just that he used guns or knives as a way to overpower his victims, and Shannon's family had said that there's no way she would have gone with a stranger unless they had produced some sort of weapon, so they definitely considered him for this reason because that would have matched what they thought. In the end, Moore's fate was sealed. He was ultimately sentenced in multiple counties, and the combination of these landed him in jail effectively for life. Moore was not ruled in or out, but Without any other leads at the moment, the trail had gone cold. Even if they didn't have any leads to follow, the family and law enforcement were not giving up. They were determined to keep Shannon's face out there. She was a child on a milk carton, and then remember Sherrill's restaurant and gas station? In addition to having her face at the cash register on a little poster, Shannon's aunt would hand out flyers of her as the patrons left. Since they were on such a main route, a lot of long-haul truckers and tourists came through on their way to somewhere else. So Shannon's face was out there. In addition, her face was sent out in a nationwide mailing. That did produce leads coming in and a lot of sightings. In fact, at one point, investigators stated that they had received calls of sightings from over 25 states. Now, oftentimes, it was something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, I saw a girl that looked like her in a Walmart 4 years ago. Is that helpful?" And obviously, there's nothing they can really do with that. Investigators also discussed how people had good intentions, but sometimes when you see something like a face on a milk carton, your brain tends to do that thing where you just match it to the faces around you. So, of course, if she's not in 25 states all at the same time, so it's a lot of false leads. And so it's a double-edged sword because on one hand, you'll take any lead when you have nothing else going on. But then on the other, it's a lot to track them down and work into investigating each one of them, and they all can't be true, so it's difficult. It also can attract the wrong sort of attention, and that's what happened in July of 2003. The Roanoke Times reported that Mike Sherrill received a phone call one day out of the blue from a woman who said she thinks she might have been abducted as a child, and she thinks she might be Shannon. Mike's heart was racing. He said in an article, quote, "I had questions in my mind that I was going to ask her, and when I got her on the phone, my mind went blank," end quote. The woman had also called Dorothy just before Mike and relayed the same information. The woman's story was that she had very little memory of her childhood, but had recently been going to therapy, and that the therapy made memories resurface that match a lot of Shannon's. She mailed the family some childhood photographs of herself, and they did say there was a strong resemblance to their daughter. Mike and Dorothy were cautiously optimistic, but from everything I've read, they very much had their hopes up for the first time in years. But DNA testing would reveal that this woman was not Shannon. Not only was she not Shannon, but it was all an elaborate hoax. This woman had actually created different identities and voices to weave together a fictional story in different phone calls she placed to the family. She had also contacted the media for attention, and boy, had it worked. As I researched this case, more than half the articles I came across were not about the investigation or Shannon or her family, but rather this hoax and this woman. This woman, who I have chosen not to name to not give her any more attention, had a large history of hoaxes and apparently had mental illness, or so that's what the courts and professionals say. She was charged with felony identity deception and misdemeanor false reporting. She ended up doing a plea deal and in April of 2004 was sentenced to 18 months in prison and 4 years probation. Her only comment she had for the reasoning was that she was doing it to bring the case attention. Investigators said they believe this woman got all her information from websites created for Shannon and information spread around the country. Reading this gutted me. I cried just thinking of the grief this family must have felt and what torture it must have been for them. In an interview, Mike Sherrill said he was no longer angry with this woman, but he still felt the pain. He said, quote, "She hurt me, but, like she said, she was only trying to help," end quote. It broke my heart for him because even in this, he was still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. And I have to say, I don't think this woman was trying to help at all. I think she was attention-seeking and not well, but he still tried to look at the bright side and have forgiveness. Mike went on to say, 3 or 4 times a day I asked everyone, when are we going to get her? I was on top of the world. She's coming home. I asked her what she's been up to. She said she was fine and anxious to get home and see everybody. She acted like she was my daughter." End quote. Mike did recall breaking down after he found out it was all a hoax. As for Dorothy, she simply stated, "It's torn my family apart. I don't know how someone could do this." Other family members called for there to be better laws to protect families of missing people from situations like this and the harm it does. Well, I think we're still a long ways from that. Now that we're deeper into the age of the internet and we learned about catfishing and the capacity to trick people by way of catfishing, there's been a prompt for new laws for these types of cybercrimes. The FBI even has a dedicated unit to it. We still have a long way to go. For things like catfishing, there are not many cases that are actually prosecuted for this, but things are at least trending in the right direction as more people come forward and there's more visibility to the issue. Things went quiet again for a couple of years until November of 2006. The case got a new lead from an inmate named Jeffrey L. Sunnycobb, an inmate of the Warren Correctional Institution in Warren, Ohio. This inmate said that he had information about a fellow inmate who said he killed Shannon Sherrill. In the letter, Jeffrey Sunnycobb described the vehicle the suspect had owned at the time, which matched the red truck that had been seen speeding through Shannon's neighborhood on the day she went missing. The letter also referenced Brown County, Indiana, and said that Shannon's body might be there, but searches didn't turn up any traces of her. Now, Sunnycobb isn't the most upstanding citizen, we'll say. He's a sex offender for crimes against children. However, he is considered a credible informant, and his information led to indictments against the same inmate for other child homicides. The inmate Sunnycobb turned in was a man named David Elliott Penton, and let me tell you, the ride you're about to go down with the pure evil of this person is astonishing. I want to take a moment to thank you for listening this far. I research, write, edit, record, and promote this podcast all on my own in addition to my full-time job. The work is important to me, so if you like this podcast and appreciate the work that I'm doing, please share these cases and these episodes with your family and friends. You can find our page on Instagram at Simpler Time Crime Pod and our Facebook page, A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast. The more people hear about these cold cases, the better chance there is for someone to come forward with new information. So the more people who hear about these cases, the better. Please also consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts and sharing to your social media channels. Thank you so much for listening. Now, back to the show. Just a quick heads up, the information I'm about to share, I won't go into too much graphic detail because that's not necessary, but I am going to be discussing David Penton's crimes against children. So if that's going to be too disturbing for you to listen to, I'd encourage you to go ahead a little bit. David Penton is a convicted murderer in Texas and Indiana. His first run-in with law enforcement came in Bell County, Texas in 1984 with the death of his very own 2-month-old son, Michael James Penton, who died of shaken baby syndrome. David admitted that he violently shook his son when he became angered when he wouldn't stop crying. David was 26 at the time. He was found guilty in this death, but appealed his conviction, and, get this, he was freed on bond pending his conviction. Yes, a convicted murderer, freed on bond, and guess what he did? He hit the road. During this time, he is believed to have abducted and murdered several children, but here are the ones that he was actually prosecuted for. First is Christy Lynn Meeks. She was a 5-year-old in Texas who was playing outside with her brother when she was brazenly abducted, and her brother witnessed the whole thing. This was January 19th, 1985. Next is Christy Diane Proctor. This was February of 1986. So yes, at this time, he's still free, and this is, over a year later. She was a 10-year-old, and she was walking to her apartment in Dallas when she went missing and was presumed abducted. Her remains were found in a field on April 9th of 1988. She had been raped and strangled to death. Next was 4-year-old Roxanne Hope Reyes, who was picking wildflowers for her mother near her apartment in Garland, Texas on November 3rd, 1987. Her body was found May 19th, 1988, in a vacant lot in Murphy, Texas. She was found raped and strangled as well. At the time, Penton was not thought to have committed any of these crimes. These were not on the radar. But where he was caught was on the March 31st, 1988 homicide of Nidra Ross. She had been reported missing from her aunt's home in Dayton, Ohio. David Penton was a family friend, and Nidra was familiar with him. She was found murdered in a creek bend 8 months later, and she had also been raped and strangled. Because of that family connection, and because she had been seen shortly before her disappearance talking to somebody who matched Penton's description, he was charged with kidnapping and aggravated murder in her case, and he was convicted in 1990 to life without parole. Now that's where Jeffrey Sunnycobb comes in. So while Penton was in jail, somebody who was in the prison with him, Sunnycobb, claimed that he confessed to these other murders down in the Texas area, and he named those girls in those situations. And that's ultimately what led law enforcement in that direction, and Penton pleaded guilty in those cases as well. By pleading guilty, he avoided the death penalty and was just to serve his natural life out in prison without appeals or without parole. Those are just the ones that Penton was charged with and he pled guilty to, but investigators believe he's tied to even more crimes in Texas. In February of 1986, a 10-year-old girl was walking to her elementary school when she was abducted and then released by a young white man who had grabbed her on the sidewalk and pulled her into his van. After Proctor's abduction, police detectives recontacted this woman and, you guessed it, put her under hypnosis, and she identified Penton as her attacker. David Penton has also been considered a strong person of interest in the case of Ara Denise Johnson. She was abducted from her bed in her mobile home she shared with her family in Big Sandy, Texas, and this was in April of 1986. She was 5 years old at the time. Now, this one I'm not as sure of. It seems like really the only connection they have to Penton was just that he was in the very large state of Texas at that time. From every other case he's been charged in or has been considered a person of interest in, he hasn't really done a situation or a scenario where he's breaking into someone's home. It usually is these instances where kids are walking somewhere or they're on the street or they're playing around their home, but they're outside and without an adult immediately present. He also apparently mentioned it to a cellmate, which is really how it got on the radar, but it's unclear if he's really just doing that thing that some serial killers are known to do when they have nothing to lose and they just start claiming crimes they didn't commit. So it's possible that's the case here, or it's possible he was related in it. We really don't know, but he was never charged in that case, and she's never been found. Lastly, he's being considered in the case of Angelica Gandara. She was abducted walking back to her family's residence located in the 800 block of North 6th Street in Temple, Texas. This was in July of 1985, and she's never been seen since, and her body's never been recovered. She was 11 at the time of her disappearance. So going back to Sunnycobb's letters, initially the family of Shannon was frustrated that the police weren't looking into it as quickly as they hoped. And in October of 2009, Sunnycobb sent another letter to Shannon's father, which gave more information about David's alleged involvement in her disappearance. Based on the information provided, Shannon was abducted by David and was alive for 3 days as he drove her to Texas, where he possibly murdered her. There's never been any information to fully substantiate this, but police did look into it seriously. They took blood samples from Shannon's parents to test against clothing recovered from Penton's possessions. Dorothy was asked by police to look at photographs of different underwear belonging to young girls that were found in Penton's possessions. Now, just for a minute, imagine that. This woman has to look through pictures of little girls' underwear from a man that raped and murdered several young children, and she has to look to see if possibly her little girls are among them. That's the side of this that I feel like people don't talk about enough in the invisible grief that families go through. I can't imagine how traumatizing that was. In the end, she said that most of the styles didn't match what Shannon would have worn in 1986, but there was one that possibly fit. She couldn't be sure, she just couldn't rule it out. When David Penton was questioned by Indiana State Police, he said he was expecting that they would interview him and he expected to be charged with kidnapping and murdering Shannon. However, the prosecutor denied any charges against him because they didn't have any evidence other than circumstantial evidence to prove he did it. After that, Penton stopped cooperating with authorities in any case, but he does say he'll talk before he dies. At the time of this recording, Penton is still only 66 years old, so that could be years from now. For a man that's scheduled to live out the rest of his life in prison, it feels like one last chance that he's trying to capture control over other people and torture and re-victimize the families of those whom he's harmed. So, what did happen to Shannon Sherrill? Did David Penton or David Ray Moore happen to be driving through and strike up on finding the girl alone? Had one of them been watching the children playing hide and seek for a bit and then made their move? Had someone who was there for the festival been opportunistic? Something I thought of brought me back to my times playing hide and seek as a child. You see, I'm the youngest kid, and my older sisters and their friends would always be much better at hide and seek than me. They were good about including me, but I was no match for the competition. Sometimes my mom or another adult around would see my little frustrated face. Careful not to let the big kids know she was helping me, she would put her index finger up to her lips and make the quiet motion, and then point to a place she thought would be a good hiding spot. It was said that there were several people outside on the weekend day and everyone in the neighborhood knew each other. It got me thinking. Maybe one of those trusted adults Shannon knew from the neighborhood motioned her their way and then used it as a ploy to lure her away. Maybe that's how no witnesses saw or heard anything. It's just speculation, but I haven't ever heard anyone theorize this before, and I thought it was worth mentioning. It also aligned with something her dad said in an interview. He said something that haunted him was that on his last visit with her, she had laid down on the floorboards of his truck when it was time to go back to her mother's and begged him not to make her go back. Now, Shannon was young, and divorced kid dynamics can be tricky. I'm familiar. Sometimes those transitions are hard, so maybe it was just that. Or maybe there was more to it. Maybe Shannon was fearful of someone in the neighborhood or someone who had contact with her mother. The bottom line is we still don't know, and that's where the case stands today. In the meantime, everyone is left in the wake. Most of the original investigators have died. The widow of one of them said he was so determined to figure out her case before he died. Another investigator died of MS, very young. Her aunt says that when she pictures her, even though she'd be in her 40s now, she only pictures her as a 6-year-old. Gary Campbell, the original marshal on the case, said in an interview, quote, "What disturbs me is I told her parents, don't worry, we'll find her, and I never did find her." If you have any information on the disappearance of Shannon Sherrill, please contact Indiana State Police Detective Matt Lawrence at 317-899-8577. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime. Join us next Monday as we dive into another cold, unsolved case from the early 2000s or before. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth is so important to this podcast, so please tell your friends. Thank you so much for listening.